Here we are in October, so it must be time to start thinking about Christmas, right? I know some of you are already listening to Christmas music and getting decorations ready. And if you were with us last week, you know that I introduced a new Bible study series about getting ready for Christmas. Don't get me wrong, I'm not over anxious. It's that there's so much that I hope to cover in the time between now and Christmas that we simply must get started. Let me remind you just how important this is. It seems that there are at least two foundational, non-negotiable points that a Christian must believe. Jesus rose from the dead, the resurrection. And Jesus is the Messiah, the one promised by the Old Testament prophets. More to the point, our Wednesday study will explore the evidence and make what I hope will be a compelling argument that Jesus, and only Jesus, is the one spoken of by the prophets. By the way, a good place to start is to recognize that Jesus himself claimed that the prophecies were pointing to him. In the Gospel of Luke, we find that amazing story of Jesus. This is after the resurrection, when he appeared to two men on the road to Emmaus. These two men, they're down in the dumps, feeling defeated, sad, and forlorn. Do you remember what Jesus said to them? In Luke chapter 24, beginning in verse 25, Jesus said, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself." He explained that he indeed was the fulfillment of these prophecies about the Messiah. Well, how far back do we go to find prophecies that Jesus fulfilled? How about to Genesis? At least 3 times in the book of Genesis, God promised that all nations would be blessed through Abraham. All nations would be blessed through Abraham. First in Genesis 12, the first 3 verses. This was God's original covenant with Abram, who became Abraham. Then in Genesis chapter 18, verse 18, that's the scene in which Abraham intercedes for Sodom and Gomorrah. And then Genesis chapter 22, verse 18. This was after Abraham had proved his faithfulness by being willing to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. All 3 of these places, God made that covenant that all nations would be blessed through Abraham. By the way, it's probably interesting to remember that in the scene with God and Abraham and Isaac, that God actually provided the sacrifice to take Isaac's place. Interesting point that we need to remember. Well, years later, in the book of Acts, again, this is after the resurrection, we have an account where Peter and John were doing ministry, and there was a lame man who was healed. And of course, the religious leaders objected to that, and all the people were kind of astounded. Peter, as you might remember, began to preach. And in that sermon, he pointed out that the covenant that we just talked about from Genesis 12 and Genesis 18 and Genesis 22, that this covenant was fulfilled in Jesus. First of all, it's in Acts chapter 3, if you want to go read it. He says that Jesus was the reason that the man was healed. It was Jesus who had done the healing. And then in verses 25 and 26 of chapter 3, he says this Jesus was the one that it's God's only Son, the one that fulfilled that covenant that all nations would be blessed. One more let me put on the table for us. Paul, in his letter to the Galatian believers, was proclaiming the truth of salvation by faith, and this salvation being for Jews and non-Jews alike. He wrote in Galatians 3, let me just turn over and quickly read that for you. Galatians chapter 3, pages sticking together, right? Galatians chapter 3, verse 8. The scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the nations by faith, preached the gospel to Abraham beforehand, saying, in you all the nations shall be blessed. So once again, the reference all the way back to God's covenant with Abraham from Genesis being fulfilled in Jesus, that this was the blessing for all nations, was the Messiah. The bottom line is this: the covenant indicated that the one, the Messiah, would come through Abraham. It would be in the lineage of Abraham. If you look to Matthew chapter 1, where we find the famous begats, right? In the begats, we see the genealogy of Jesus. And in verse 1 of Matthew 1, we read the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So right there in the first verse, Jesus connected back to Abraham. But Matthew goes on. In verse 2, he begins with Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, and goes right on through Abraham's lineage. And we come down to verse 16, and it says, Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Christ. And so Matthew, beginning with Abraham, follows the genealogy to show that Jesus did in fact come from the line of Abraham in fulfillment of that prophecy. He had to be of the line of Abraham in order to fulfill the prophecy that all the nations would be blessed through Abraham. You know, sometimes there are those that say that Jesus might have known about various prophecies and therefore he could have intentionally fulfilled them. Well, this is actually a prophecy that Jesus could not have intentionally fulfilled. Let me illustrate the point. I love being a Tyner. I'm proud of my heritage. And sometimes students, they'll call me Tyner. Not Dr. Tyner, not Professor Tyner, just simply, hey, Tyner. And then I've had other people come to me and say, well, isn't that kind of disrespectful? Well, in the first place, I'm sort of not into all that title thing for respect. But in the second place, when someone calls me Tyner, it's sort of a compliment. I sort of receive it very positively because I'm proud of my family heritage and I'm proud of that name. But here's the truth of the matter. As proud as I am of that name, I did not have the opportunity to choose that name. As proud as I am of my heritage and my ancestors, I did not have the opportunity to choose my heritage nor my ancestors. They were chosen for me. I was just blessed, right? But the same is true of Jesus. Jesus could not intentionally choose his ancestry. He could not intentionally choose to be descended from Abraham. You see the point? And so he could not have intentionally fulfilled that prophecy. It was chosen for him. And yes, it was prophesied several thousand years beforehand. Just the first of many prophecies that we're going to look at over this next several weeks to hopefully show that Jesus was the only possible Messiah as prophesied from the Old Testament.